Since 1945, the world has fought roughly 60 major armed conflicts. In at least 40 of them, one weapon was present, the same weapon, traced by a Russian military historian, conflict by conflict, across every continent that has one. Roughly 100 million of these rifles exist. 500 million firearms circulate on this planet, and 1 in 5 belongs to a single family, from a single design, born on a single factory floor. And here is the strange part. For most of the 20th century, you could not visit the place that made them. The city of Izhevsk in the western Urals was closed to all foreigners. No journalists, no diplomats, no tourists. Even Soviet citizens found it difficult to enter without a reason. The most widely distributed machine in the history of warfare came from a city travelers were not allowed to see. The product went everywhere. The gates stayed shut. But the strangest part is not the secrecy, it is the age. This factory was not built by Stalin. It was not built by the Soviet Union at all. It was founded by a Tsar, by decree of Emperor Alexander I, in 1807, 110 years before the Soviet Union existed. It armed Russia against Napoleon. It armed Russia against the Kaiser. It armed the Soviet Union against Hitler, and then it armed half the world against the other half. It outlived every government that ever owned it. This is the story of that factory. And before it ends, the factory's most famous employee, 92 years old, near death, will write a letter to a priest asking whether he is personally to blame for the deaths his design caused. The same year he mails it, the factory itself will go bankrupt. Both happened within months of each other. Neither is a coincidence. If you want to know how a city nobody could visit put a rifle into 2/3 of the world's wars, and why the man behind it spent his final years asking for absolution, stay with this one. And a quick like and subscribe helps us keep pulling stories like it out of the archives. Start with the treaty that nobody believed. In June of 1807, Napoleon defeated the Russian army at Friedland. The result was the treaties of Tilsit, a peace agreement between the French and Russian empires, signed with handshakes and pageantry on a raft in the middle of a river. Alexander I signed it. And then, that same year, he did something that tells you exactly how much he trusted it. He ordered the construction of a new weapons factory, not near the western frontier, where a factory would be convenient, but deep in the western Urals, on the banks of a small river called the Izh, nearly 500 miles east of Moscow, far enough that no European army could reach it. The decree was issued on June 10, 1807, a peace treaty in one hand, a weapons factory in the other. The man charged with building it was a mining engineer named Andrei Deryabin. There was already a small ironworks on the Izh, and Deryabin made a decision that shaped the next 2 centuries. He merged the ironworks and the weapons factory into a single enterprise. The factory would never wait on anyone else for raw material. Ore came in one end, rifles came out the other. It was vertical integration before anyone had a name for it, and it meant the factory could scale on its own schedule, answerable to nothing but demand. Demand came fast. The first weapons, smooth-bore flintlock muskets, were produced in the autumn of 1807, the same year the decree was signed. In its first 4 years, the factory turned out around 2,000 guns. Then Napoleon invaded in 1812, and output increased roughly tenfold, with more than 6,000 guns delivered to the Russian army during the war. Napoleon won at Borodino. Napoleon took Moscow. Moscow burned. And 500 miles to the east, behind the geography Alexander had chosen for exactly this scenario, The factory on the Izh kept producing. The location did its job the first time it was tested. It would keep doing that job for the next century and a half. The 19th century was a long climb. Percussion rifles replaced flintlocks in time for the Crimean War, with around 130,000 firearms shipped during the war years. In 1870, the factory began producing Russia's first mass cartridge-firing bolt-action rifle, the Berdan, and note the name, because it belongs to an American. Hiram Berdan, an American inventor, co-developed the round with a Russian colonel named Gorlov, an American design manufactured at scale in the Urals. Hold that thought for about 80 years, because the flow of ideas is going to reverse. By 1870, Izhevsk had outproduced both of Russia's other great armories, Tula and Sestroretsk, and once its steel-making matured, it became the barrel supplier to the whole industry, with Tula alone drawing up to 360,000 Izhevsk barrels a year. By 1891, it was manufacturing the Mosin rifle, the famous three-line rifle that would arm Russian soldiers through 2 world wars. There is a story the factory tells about itself from this era, and it is worth hearing with one eyebrow raised. In 1837, the future Emperor Alexander II visited Izhevsk. According to Russian official histories, 11 rifles were disassembled in front of him, their parts mixed together in a pile, and the rifles reassembled before his eyes. Perfect interchangeability, decades before most of the world's armories could manage it. Maybe it happened exactly that way. It should be said that the most famous version of this exact demonstration, Eli Whitney's, before the American Congress, was later revealed to have been staged, the parts secretly marked in advance. Whether the Izhevsk demonstration was rigorous or theater, no independent record survives to say. But the story matters either way, because it tells you what the factory believed it was for. Not craftsmanship, not artistry, interchangeability. Identical parts, in identical weapons, in enormous numbers, assembled by ordinary hands. That idea, that a rifle is not an object, but a system of repeatable parts, was the factory's real product. And in the 20th century, it would carry Izhevsk to a number that sounds like propaganda until you check it. More rifles than every factory in Nazi Germany combined. That number is next. What Izhevsk perfected in the 20th century was not a gun. It was a method. Through the 1930s, the factory reorganized itself around design and flow. A chief designer bureau was established. In 1933 came a new designs bureau, developing and modifying armament in-house. The factory tooled up for the modernized Mosin, for Simonov's automatic rifle, for Tokarev's self-loading rifle and pistol. And in 1938 it made the decisive move. Assembly of gun stocks and barrels was put on a conveyor line. Flow production. The rifle stopped being a thing a worker made and became a thing that moved past workers, each adding a part. In 1939, the enterprise split in two, a metallurgical plant and a machine-building plant, so that steel and assembly could each scale without waiting on the other. Deriabin's logic from 1807, refined for the century of total war. Then the war came, and the method met its moment. In the autumn of 1941, as the German army drove toward Moscow, entire defense factories were evacuated eastward and rebuilt in Izhevsk. According to the Russian production records, over the course of the Great Patriotic War, the Izhevsk plant produced 11.3 million rifles and carbines. All German factories combined over the same period produced 10.3 million. One factory complex on one river, outproducing the entire small arms industry of Nazi Germany, along with more than 130,000 aviation machine guns, aircraft cannon, and anti-tank rifles. The company's own histories claim that at peak output, Izhevsk produced enough weapons in a single day to fully equip a rifle division. That figure comes from the factory itself, so treat it as a boast, but the 11 million rifles are counted, and they set the boast's scale. So, when a wounded tank sergeant named Mikhail Kalashnikov won the Soviet Union's assault rifle competition in 1947, the question was never just whose design won. It was who could build it. Kalashnikov was not a product of the factory. He was a tank mechanic, wounded in combat, who had started sketching weapons in a hospital bed. The design that emerged from years of trials became the AK-47, and production was assigned to Izhevsk. Trial batches came off the line in 1948. The Soviet Army formally adopted it in 1949. Kalashnikov moved to Izhevsk and stayed for the rest of his working life, 6 decades at the same factory. And here, the factory's method and the rifle's design fused into something new. The AK-47 was conceived around stamped sheet metal receivers, cheap, fast, light. But the early stamping failed. The technology wasn't ready. So Izhevsk did what a factory with 140 years of process knowledge does. It fell back to a machined milled steel receiver as a stopgap and built that for a decade until Soviet stamping matured. In 1959, the stamped receiver version arrived, the AKM, roughly a kilogram lighter, faster to produce, and destined to become the most manufactured variant of the most manufactured rifle on Earth. The lesson sits in plain sight. The drawing alone was never enough. What made the Kalashnikov reproducible was the factory's accumulated knowledge of how to make a million of anything. And the design philosophy pointed the same direction as the production philosophy: loose tolerances. Roughly 8 major moving parts. A weapon that forgave dirt, forgave neglect, forgave inexperience. A weapon any hands, anywhere, could strip and reassemble. Remember where this was happening. Behind the gates of a closed city, its residents vetted, its streets off-limits to every foreigner on Earth. The most controlled production line in the world was perfecting a product that required no control at all. A rifle designed so that no one would ever need Izhevsk's permission or Izhevsk's expertise to keep it running. Then the Soviet Union did something no Western arms maker would ever do with its flagship product. It gave the plans away. What happened when those licenses spread and then expired is how one factory ended up inside 2/3 of the world's wars. The Soviet Union treated the Kalashnikov less like a product and more like an ideology with a trigger. The plans were leased cheaply to friendly governments, and production lines rose across the Warsaw Pact and beyond. Poland, Bulgaria, Romania, Hungary, East Germany, China, Egypt, and onward. Most of them built the stamped AKM pattern precisely because Izhevsk had made it so buildable. That was the point. A client state with mills, presses, and rifling machines could arm itself. Nothing high-tech, nothing that needed the Urals. The numbers that resulted have no precedent in the history of manufactured objects. Roughly 100 million Kalashnikov family rifles have been produced. By Russia's own accounting, only about half are the genuine Russian-made article. The other 50 million came from roughly 30 foreign manufacturers, many working from Soviet-era licenses that had long expired, and many working from no license at all. By the 2000s, an estimated 1 million unlicensed Kalashnikovs were being produced every single year. In the conflict zones where they pooled, Somalia, Mozambique, Congo, Ethiopia, a working rifle could be had for as little as $30. The knockoffs spread so far that Khyber Pass workshops hand-built them, and North Korea made the pattern its standard issue. Which brings back the number this story opened with. The Russian military historian Alexander Uzhhanov, in his 2009 biography of Kalashnikov, counted the rifle present in at least 40 of the 60 large armed conflicts fought since 1945. It armed the states of the Warsaw Pact and the guerrillas, who fought states everywhere. It appears on the flag of Mozambique, a rifle from a Urals factory, sewn onto the national banner of a country in southern Africa. It has served in something close to 100 countries. During the Cold War, Izhevsk's rifle and Eugene Stoner's rifle faced each other across nearly every proxy war the superpowers fought, and the factory kept adding to its side of the ledger. In 1963, Izhevsk designer Yevgeny Dragunov built the SVD sniper rifle out of the plant's sporting rifle heritage, and it became the second Izhevsk silhouette recognized in every conflict zone on Earth. The factory itself kept sprawling into ordinary life, the way city-sized industrial organisms do. It built motorcycles, more than 11 million of them. It built cars, machine tools, hunting guns by the millions, biathlon rifles that equipped national teams, an entire civilian economy radiating from the same riverbank Deryabin chose. But hold the two halves of this picture side by side, because they do not fit together, and that is the point. Foreigners could not enter Izhevsk, not one, for decades, and Izhevsk reached everyone. The fence around the city kept people out. It kept nothing in. The rifle crossed every border its makers were forbidden to cross, until it existed in numbers no government, including the one that created it, could count, recall, or control. That loss of control is not a metaphor. It arrived on the factory's own balance sheet, and it arrived in the conscience of its most famous designer in the same 12 months. Two things happened in the spring of 2012, a few weeks apart, in the same city. In April, Izhmash, the name the plant had carried since 1975, the direct descendant of Alexander's 1807 factory, the birthplace of 100 million rifles, was declared bankrupt. Not defeated by a rival, bled out by its own success. The Soviet Union had seeded the world with production lines and let the paperwork rot. Izhmash only secured patent protection for the Kalashnikov system in the late 1990s, half a century after the design left the building. By then, the counterfeit flood was unstoppable. The company's director estimated losses of $400 to $500 million every year to unlicensed production. At one point, Venezuela stood as the only fully legitimate foreign license holder on Earth. And the deepest irony hid in the sales ledger. By 2012, 70% of the factory's output was civilian rifles, and roughly 40% of those were exported to the United States, American sport shooters buying nearly as many Izhevsk Kalashnikovs as the Russian army and police combined. The factory that armed 40 wars could not collect on any of them. In May, the following month, a letter arrived at the office of Patriarch Kirill, head of the Russian Orthodox Church. It was typed on personal stationery and signed, in the words of its author, as a slave of God. the designer Mikhail Kalashnikov. He was 92 years old. He had been baptized into the church at 91. For most of his life, he had refused all responsibility for what his rifle did after it left the factory. He built it, he always said, to defend the motherland. Now, near the end, the letter told a different story. "My spiritual pain is unbearable," he wrote. He kept returning, he said, to one unsolved question. If his rifle had taken people's lives, was he, a Christian, a believer, to blame for their deaths? His daughter Elena later said she believed a priest helped her father compose it. The Patriarch's office replied with comfort, "When weapons serve to protect the fatherland, the Church supports both their creators and the soldiers who carry them." Whether that answer quieted the question, no record says. He died the following year, in December 2013, in Izhevsk, at 94. And then came the resurrection, the corporate kind. The state conglomerate Rostec had taken control of the bankrupt plant. In 2013, Izhmash was merged with its neighbor, the Izhevsk mechanical plant, and Deputy Prime Minister Dmitry Rogozin pitched the new name to Vladimir Putin with a logic that would have been unthinkable in the closed city. Izhmash and Izhmech, with due respect, were not brands. Kalashnikov was a brand. Putin agreed. The 200-year-old factory survived by taking, as its trademark, the name of the man who died asking forgiveness for what it built. A year later, the United States and the European Union sanctioned Kalashnikov concern over the annexation of Crimea, and the secret factory completed its long inversion from a name no foreigner was allowed to approach into a name foreign governments wrote into law. So look again at the title of this story, because by now every word of it has come apart. The secret Soviet factory that armed a third of the world's wars. It was never really Soviet. It predates the Soviet Union by 110 years and outlived it by decades. It armed not a third of the world's wars, but, by the documented count, 2/3. And its secrecy was always the strangest kind, a city sealed at the perimeter, whose product became the least secret machine human beings have ever made, recognizable in silhouette to people who have never touched one, on every continent, in every decade since 1949. Count what the factory on the Izh has outlived. Alexander I, who decreed it, the Romanov dynasty, which owned it, Napoleon, who burned Moscow 500 miles short of its gates, the Reich, whose entire arms industry it outproduced, the Soviet Union, which sealed its city and gave away its plans, its own bankruptcy, even its own names, the plant renamed to Izhmash in 1975 and to Kalashnikov in 2013. The city itself renamed Ustinov in 1984 after a Soviet defense minister and changed back 3 years later because the people who lived there never stopped calling it Izhevsk. Governments, borders, and names washed over this place like weather. The production line remained. In 2004, a museum opened in Izhevsk dedicated to Kalashnikov and the rifle. 10,000 people visit every month. Its director once described its purpose as an act of separation, separating the weapon as an instrument of killing from the workers who spent their lives producing it. It is a careful mission and a telling one, because it concedes that the two things have to be pried apart. For 2 centuries in this city, they were the same thing. The gates, of course, are open now. Anyone can go. You can take the train from Moscow, walk the esplanade down to the pond, stand under the old factory clock tower that has marked the skyline since the age of the Tsars, the factory's emblem, keeping time over the water where Dariabin joined an ironworks to an armory in 1807. The city that no outsider could enter will now show you everything, which leaves only the one inversion that can never be undone. The gates are open. It is the rifles that never came home, 100 million of them. Out in the world, the closed city armed, beyond recall, beyond count, still keeping a schedule of their own.